The Iron Islands have always been a hard place, a cluster of rocks and rain where the sea takes more than it gives. The people there call themselves Ironborn, and they pride themselves on strength, on taking what they need with axe and sword. They pray to the drowned god, a deity as cold and merciless as the waters that surround their home. But even among the Ironborn, even among a people who celebrate reaving and raiding, there are lines that should not be crossed. There are cruelties that make even hardened warriors look away. Euron Greyjoy crossed those lines before he was old enough to grow a proper beard. He was born on Pike, the ancestral seat of House Greyjoy, sometime around the year 266 after Aegon's conquest. The exact date is lost to history, but what matters is this. Euron was the third son of Euron Greyjoy, Lord of the Iron Islands. He had an older brother, Balon, who would inherit everything. He had another brother, Victarion, strong and loyal, simple in his devotions. And he had younger brothers too, including Aeron, called the Damper in later years, a priest of the drowned god who would tremble at the mere mention of Euron's name. That terror started early. Pike is a grim castle, even by the standards of Westeros. It sits on a cliff above the sea, its towers connected by swaying rope bridges that creak and sway in the constant wind. The halls are cold, the walls are damp. The sound of waves crashing against rock never stops, not day or night, not summer or winter. It is a place that shapes hard men, men who do not flinch at blood or storm. But Euron was different. He did not simply endure the harshness of Pike. He seemed to revel in it. He seemed to feed on it. The stories about his childhood are whispered, not shouted. The Ironborn do not like to speak of weakness, and admitting that one of their own was touched by madness feels too much like admitting defeat. But the stories exist. They always exist. One tale, repeated by thralls and servants who survived those years, tells of a day when Euron found his younger brother Aeron near the tide pools below the castle. Aeron was young then, maybe 6 or 7 years old, small and quick and curious. Euron was older, already tall, already marked by that unsettling smile that never quite reached his eyes. He held Aeron under the water, not to kill him. Not quite, just long enough to feel the boy's lungs burn, to feel his small body thrash and panic. Then Euron would pull him up, let him gasp and cough and cry, and then push him under again, over and over. And the whole time, Euron was laughing. When someone finally stopped him, Euron's only explanation was simple. He said he was teaching Aeron about the drowned god. He said Aeron needed to learn what drowning felt like if he wanted to be a true Ironborn. Aeron never forgot. Decades later, as a grown man and a priest, he would still wake from nightmares of that day, still feel the cold water filling his nose and throat, still hear his brother's laughter echoing in his ears. But that was only the beginning. Euron was clever, dangerously clever. He learned quickly, whether it was the sword or the sea, or the subtle cruelties that could be inflicted without leaving marks. He was handsome too, in a sharp-edged way, with dark hair and eyes that seemed to see too much. One of those eyes was as blue as a summer sky. The other, according to those who knew him, was as black as a moonless night. Some said he lost the blue eye later, that he covered it with a patch after some injury or curse. Others whispered that the eye had always been wrong, that even as a boy, Euron's gaze could make you feel like something was crawling beneath your skin. His father, Quelon, was an unusual lord for the Iron Islands. He tried to modernize, to bring the Ironborn closer to the laws and customs of the rest of Westeros. He discouraged the old ways of reaving. He took a mainland wife. He even fought for King Aerys during Robert's rebellion, hoping to earn favor and legitimacy for his house. Euron hated all of it. To him, his father was weak. The Ironborn were meant to take, not to beg. They were meant to be feared, not respected. The old way, the ancient tradition of raiding and paying the iron price for what you wanted, that was the truth of the islands. Everything else was a lie, told by soft Greenlanders who had never felt the spray of salt water or the weight of an axe. Balon, the eldest son, agreed with Euron on this point, though he would come to regret that common ground. Balon wanted to restore the old way. He wanted the Ironborn to be a power again, to remind the Seven Kingdoms that the islands were not some forgotten backwater. And for a time, Euron supported him. For a time, they were united in their contempt for their father's choices. But Euron's ambitions were never about the Iron Islands. They were about Euron. Victarion, the second brother, was different. He was strong, loyal, and pious in the way only a true believer can be. He trusted the drowned god. He trusted his brothers. He followed orders without question. And Euron saw all of that as weakness, as something to be exploited. The Iron Islands do not produce soft men, but they do produce sailors. The best in the world, some say. Every Ironborn boy is put on a ship as soon as he can walk, and by the time he is a man, he knows the sea better than he knows the halls of his own castle. Euron was no exception. He took to the water like he was born to it, learning to read the wind and the waves, to feel the shift of a ship beneath his feet, to strike fast and vanish before the enemy could respond. But where other captains raided for plunder and glory, Euron raided for something else. He raided for the thrill of it. He raided because he enjoyed the fear in his victims' eyes. He raided because it made him feel like a god. His first command was a modest longship, crewed by hard men who had sailed with his father and his brothers. They expected him to lead raids on the western coast of Westeros, to bring back salt wives and stolen goods, to prove himself in the traditional way. Euron had other ideas. He took his ship farther than most Ironborn dared. He sailed down the coast of the Reach, past Old Town, past the Arbor, into waters where the Greyjoy name meant nothing. He came back with strange treasures, things that made the older men uneasy, trinkets from the summer isles, jewelry from the free cities. And always, he came back with stories that seemed too wild to believe. Stories of storms that obeyed his commands, stories of ships that sank without a fight, as if the sea itself had turned against them. Stories of men who went mad at the sight of his sails. Most dismissed these stories as the boasting of a young captain trying to build his reputation. But some noticed that Euron's crew never contradicted him. Some noticed that the men who sailed with him came back different, quieter, as if something inside them had been scraped away. And some noticed that the men who questioned Euron too loudly had a habit of disappearing. The years passed. Balon became lord after their father died during Robert's rebellion. He married. He began to plan his own rebellion, his own attempt to break the Iron Islands free from the Iron Throne. Victarion remained the dutiful brother, commanding the Iron Fleet with skill and discipline. Aeron, traumatized and lost, drowned himself in drink and woman, trying to forget the boy who had held him under the water. and Euron kept sailing, kept raiding, kept bringing back treasures and tales that grew stranger with each voyage. Then came the incident that would change everything. Victarion had a wife. Her name is not widely remembered, lost to the footnotes of history. But what matters is that Victarion loved her. He was not a man given to soft emotions, but he loved her in the blunt, uncomplicated way he loved the sea and the drowned. God, Euron seduced her, or perhaps he forced her. The truth of what happened is unclear, buried beneath years of silence and shame. What is clear is that Euron bedded his brother's wife, and when Victarion discovered it, the damage was already done. By Ironborn law, by the harsh codes that govern their society, Victarion had every right to kill Euron. He had every right to take his axe and split his brother's skull and throw the body into the sea. And part of him wanted to, part of him ached to do it. But there was a problem. Euron was his brother, and kinslaying, even among the Ironborn, even among a people who celebrate violence, is a crime that stains the soul. The gods do not forgive kinslaying. Men do not forget it. So Victarion made a different choice. He killed his wife instead. He beat her to death with his own hands, and when it was done, when her blood was on the stones and her body was cold, he went to Balon and told him everything. Balon's response was swift. He could not execute Euron without risking the wrath of their other brothers, without tearing House Greyjoy apart. But he could not ignore what had happened. The insult was too great. The betrayal was too deep. So Balon did the only thing he could. He exiled Euron. He gave him a ship, the Silence, and he told him to leave the Iron Islands and never return. Not while Balon lived, not while there was a Greyjoy sitting in the seastone chair. Euron smiled when he heard the sentence. That same unsettling smile that had haunted his brothers since childhood. He did not argue. He did not beg for mercy. He simply took his ship and sailed away, out into the sunset sea, beyond the sight of Pike's towers, beyond the reach of his family's judgment. And as the Silence disappeared into the horizon, Victarion stood on the cliffs and watched it go. He had won, in a sense. He had rid himself of the brother who had destroyed his marriage, who had humiliated him in front of the entire island. But even then, even as the black sails faded into the distance, Victarion felt a cold certainty settle into his chest. This was not over. Euron was not the kind of man who accepted defeat. He was not the kind of man who forgave. Someday, Victarion knew, Euron would come back. And when he did, the Iron Islands would pay for sending him away. The Ironborn tell themselves they are hard. They tell themselves they do not fear death, or pain, or the wrath of their enemies. But on the day Euron Greyjoy sailed into exile, there were men on Pike who felt something they would never admit aloud. They felt relief. Because whatever Euron had been before, whatever cruelties he had inflicted on his brothers and his crew, they were certain of one thing. Exile would not make him better. The sea would not soften him. The world beyond the Iron Islands would not teach him mercy. Euron was gone, and the only question was what he would become in the years ahead, far from the laws of Westeros, far from the eyes of his family. The answer, as the world would learn, was something far worse than anyone imagined. The Silence left Pike on a grey morning when the mist hung thick over the water and the gulls screamed like mourners at a funeral. Euron Greyjoy stood at the helm, one hand on the carved wooden rail, his eyes fixed on the western horizon. Behind him, the towers of his ancestral home grew smaller and smaller until they were nothing more than shadows in the fog. he did not look back. Not once. Exile, to most men, is a punishment. It is a severing, a casting out, a mark of shame that follows you wherever you go. But to Euron, exile was something else entirely. It was freedom. The Ironborn have many laws, many traditions, many expectations. A captain must share his plunder with his crew. A lord must listen to his vassals. A son must honour his father. These are the chains that bind men to their place in the world, that keep society from tearing itself apart. Euron had always hated those chains. And now, sailing, away from the Iron Islands, with nothing but a ship and a crew of desperate men, he was finally free to break them. The Silence was a fitting name for his vessel. It was a longship, sleek and fast, painted black from stem to stern. The sails were black too, dyed the colour of a moonless night. In the years to come, those black sails would become a symbol of terror across a dozen seas, a warning that death was approaching on the wind. But in those early days, the Silence was just another Ironborn raider, no different from 100 others prowling the coasts of Westeros and Essos. What made it different was the crew. Euron's first act as an exiled captain was to gather men, not good men, not honourable men, not even particularly skilled men. He gathered men who had nothing left to lose, men who had committed crimes too dark to forgive, men who had been cast out by their own families, who had nowhere else to go, who would follow any captain willing to take them aboard. These were the outcasts of the Iron Islands. Thieves who had stolen from their own kin, cowards who had fled from battle, men who had committed unspeakable acts and been exiled for it. They came to Euron because no one else would have them. They came because the Silence was their last chance, and Euron welcomed them all. He gave them purpose, he gave them a ship, and then, one by one, he took their tongues. The ritual happened at night, under the stars, far from any shore where witnesses might see. Euron would summon a man to the deck, and 2 crewmen would hold him down, while a third brought out a bronze knife, heated red in a brazier. The man would struggle, of course. He would scream and beg and try to fight. But it never mattered. The knife would do its work, and when it was done, the man's tongue would be thrown into the sea as an offering to the drowned god. Or so Euron claimed. In truth, the offering was to something else, something darker, something that did not care for prayers or devotion. Some men died from the shock or the blood loss. Their bodies were thrown overboard without ceremony. Others survived, their mouths sewn shut with rough thread, their ability to speak stolen forever. These men became Euron's crew, silent, obedient, incapable of betrayal. Because a man with no tongue cannot tell secrets. He cannot whisper to enemies about where his captain is sailing or what treasures he carries. He cannot complain or argue or spread dissent among the crew. He is a tool, nothing more, and Euron wielded his crew like a carpenter wields a hammer. But why did the men agree to it? Why did they let Euron mutilate them without rebellion? The answer is simple and terrible. Euron gave them a choice. Lose your tongue and sail with me, he would say, or refuse and be thrown overboard right now. For men who had already lost everything, who had no home to return to and no future worth living, the choice was not really a choice at all. They took the knife, they took the pain, and they became part of the Silence. Word of this spread, slowly at first, whispered in taverns and ports where sailors gathered. A black-sailed ship with a crew of mutes. A captain who smiled when he should have frowned, who laughed when he should have wept. A man who did not fear the gods or the sea or death itself. Most dismissed it as legend, the kind of story sailors tell to pass the time. But some paid attention. Some began to watch the horizon a little more carefully when they saw black sails in the distance. The Silence sailed south, away from the cold waters of the Sunset Sea, and into warmer, richer hunting grounds. Euron's first targets were the Stepstones, that long chain of rocky islands between Westeros and Essos, where pirates and smugglers had operated for centuries. It was a lawless place, a place where strength and cunning mattered more than birth or honor. Euron thrived there. He would strike at dawn, when the mist still clung to the water, and the watchmen were tired from a long night. His crew moved in perfect silence, no war cries or battle songs to give warning. They would board a ship, kill anyone who resisted, and take whatever they wanted: gold, weapons, food, and sometimes people. Euron had a taste for captives, not for ransom, though he took that too when the opportunity arose. No, he wanted captives for other reasons. He wanted to learn from them. He wanted to hear their stories, their secrets, their knowledge of the world beyond the Iron Islands. A merchant from Volantis taught him the trade routes of the Summer Sea. A navigator from the Basilisk Isles showed him how to read the stars in southern skies. A hedge witch from the shadow of the Bone Mountains whispered to him about blood magic and sacrifice. And when Euron had taken everything they had to offer, when he had drained them of knowledge like a leech drains blood, he would cut out their tongues and add them to his crew or throw them into the sea. The silence grew richer. The hold filled with plunder, chests of silver and gold, bolts of silk and Myrish lace, jars of spices from the Summer Isles, weapons of castle-forged steel. Euron kept the best for himself and distributed the rest among his crew, following the old Ironborn custom. But there was always something else, something he kept hidden in his cabin, locked away from prying eyes: books, scrolls, maps, objects that meant nothing to common sailors, but everything to a man like Euron. He was building a collection, a library of forbidden knowledge, pieced together from 12 lands and 100 murdered scholars. He read everything, absorbed everything, searching for something that even he could not fully articulate. Power, perhaps, or understanding, or simply the certainty that he was more than just another exiled pirate. The Stepstones became too familiar, too easy. Euron grew bored with ambushing fat merchant ships and raiding undefended villages. He wanted more. He wanted to test himself against real dangers, to sail into waters where even the bravest captains feared to go. So he turned east, toward the Summer Sea and beyond. The Summer Sea is vast and warm, bounded by the southern coast of Essos and the northern shores of Sothorios. It is a rich sea, full of trade and opportunity, but also full of storms and pirates and ancient curses that sailors speak of in hushed tones. Euron sailed through it all, his black sails catching the wind, his mute crew working in eerie coordination. He raided the Basilisk Isles, those fever-ridden rocks where the air itself could kill a man. He plundered the ruins of old Giscari colonies, pulling gold and jewelry from tombs that had been sealed for 1,000 years. He attacked slaver ships from Slaver's Bay, freeing the cargo not out of mercy, but to see what would happen, to watch chaos unfold as terrified slaves turned on their former masters, and always, always, he was searching for something. Rumors followed, the silence, like gulls follow a fishing boat. In Volantis, they spoke of a ship with black sails that had stolen a chest of ancient texts from a red priest's library. In Korth, They whispered about a one-eyed pirate who had bested 3 merchant princes in a game of Sivas, and then poisoned them all when the game was done. In Astapor, they told stories of a crew that moved without speaking, that killed without mercy, that left no survivors to tell what they had seen. Some of these stories were true. Some were exaggerations, and some were inventions, spread by Euron himself to build his legend. Because Euron understood something that most pirates did not. Fear is a weapon. Reputation is armor. If men believed he was unstoppable, if they believed he was cursed, or blessed, or touched by dark powers, they would hesitate when they saw his sails. They would surrender without a fight. They would hand over their treasures and beg for their lives. And sometimes, when the mood struck him, Euron would grant mercy. He would let a ship go, untouched and unharmed, and the grateful crew would sail back to port with wild tales of the Crow's Eye and his black-sailed ship. The legend would grow. And the next time Euron appeared on the horizon, the next ship would be even more terrified. But mercy was rare. More often, the silence left only wreckage and bodies in its wake. Euron's crew, those silent men with their sewn mouths and hollow eyes, never complained. They never questioned. They simply obeyed, carrying out every order with mechanical precision. Whether it was murder or theft or something darker, they did it without hesitation. And that silence, that perfect, terrible silence, became Euron's greatest strength. Because a crew that cannot speak cannot spread dissent. It cannot form factions or plot mutinies. It can only serve. And in serving, it made Euron more powerful than any Ironborn captain had a right to be. There were still a few men aboard the Silence who could speak. Captains that Euron had recruited. From other ships, sailors who had proven themselves too valuable to mutilate. These men knew what they had signed up for. They knew that sailing with Euron meant crossing lines that other men would not cross. They knew that the plunder was rich and the danger was constant, and the captain was mad. But they also knew that Euron was winning, that he was taking wealth and power from the world with a ruthlessness that inspired a kind of awe. And so they stayed, speaking only when spoken to, keeping their doubts to themselves, hoping that when the end came, they would not be among the victims. Years passed. How many, exactly, is hard to say. Euron did not keep careful records of his voyages. He did not send letters home or mark anniversaries. He simply sailed, season after season, moving from one sea to another, always pushing farther, always seeking the next forbidden thing. The Silence became a ghost ship in the minds of those who heard about it. A nightmare told in port taverns. A warning to young sailors about what happens when you sail too far from home, when you forget the gods and the laws and the ties that bind men to decency. And Euron, standing at the helm with his one eye gleaming and his smile sharp as a knife, seemed to relish every moment of it. Because this was what he had always wanted. Not to rule the Iron Islands, not to sit in the Seastone chair and listen to petitions from lesser lords. He wanted to be free. He wanted to be feared. He wanted to prove that he was more than just Balon's little brother, more than just another Greyjoy. He wanted to be something the world had never seen before. And as the Silence sailed on, cutting through the warm waters of the summer sea, leaving silence and ruin in its wake, Euron began to believe that he was succeeding. The world was vast. The seas were endless. And somewhere out there, beyond the edge of every map, there were secrets waiting to be taken. Euron Greyjoy intended to take them all. The farther east, Euron sailed, the stranger the world became. The summer sea gave way to waters that held older names, older dangers. These were the routes that merchants feared and map-makers marked with warnings. Here be serpents, some charts said. Here be demons. Here be death. Euron sailed toward all of it. His destination, whispered among the few speaking men left aboard the Silence, was Korth. The greatest city in the world, they called it, though whether that was true or merely Carthian arrogance, no one could say for certain. What mattered was that Karth sat at the crossroads of the known world, a place where East met West, where traders from a dozen lands came to exchange goods and gold and secrets. And where there were secrets, Euron would find them. The Silence approached Korth from the south, slipping past the trade galleys and wardromans that guarded the approaches to the city. Euron did not announce himself. He did not fly banners or seek an audience with the pureborn. He came as a shadow, quiet and careful, watching and learning before he made his move. Korth was everything the stories promised. Towers of coloured glass that caught the sun and threw rainbows across the water. Gardens filled with flowers that bloomed year-round. Markets where you could buy anything from Dothraki bloodriders to ancient manuscripts written in dead languages. The wealthy of Korth lived like kings, draped in silk and gems, waited on by servants from every corner of the earth. But Korth also had its darkness. Beneath the beauty and the wealth, there was rot. The Undying of Karth, the warlocks who dwelt in the House of the Undying, were feared even by the Carthian themselves. They drank shade of the evening, a strange blue liquid that gave them visions and extended their lives far beyond natural years. They saw the past and the future, or so they claimed. They whispered prophecies and worked magic that made the bravest men uneasy. Most sailors gave the warlocks a wide berth. Most captains wanted nothing to do with sorcery or prophecy. Euron sought them out. He came to the House of the Undying on a moonless night, alone except for two of his mute crewmen. The building was ancient, a palace of crumbling stone and twisting corridors that seemed to shift and change when you were not looking directly at them. Euron walked through those halls without fear, his footsteps echoing in the silence, until he found what he was searching for. The warlocks sat in a chamber lit by pale blue flames. There were dozens of them, thin as corpses, their lips stained blue from the shade of the evening they drank endlessly. They did not seem surprised to see him. Perhaps they had known he was coming. Perhaps they had seen it in their visions. Euron smiled at them with that sharp, cruel smile of his, and he made them an offer. "Come with me," he said. "Sail with me. Show me your magic. Teach me your secrets, and I will give you power beyond anything you have known in this dying city." The warlocks refused, of course. They were ancient and proud. They did not serve mortal men, least of all some pirate from the edge of the world. They laughed at him, their voices dry as sand, and told him to leave before they turned him into something small and broken. Euron's smile never wavered. He left the House of the Undying that night, and the warlocks thought they had won. They thought they had frightened off another fool seeking power he did not understand. They were wrong. Euron came back 3 nights later with his full crew. The mutes moved through the House of the Undying like a plague, silent and unstoppable. They dragged the warlocks from their chambers, binding them with chains and gags, ignoring their struggles and their curses. Some tried to work their magic, tried to summon visions or flames or protective spells. But Euron had prepared for that. He had learned things in his travels, dark things, and he used that knowledge now. By dawn, 6 warlocks were chained in the hold of the silence, their mouths gagged so they could not speak the words of power they needed for their sorcery. Their precious shade of the evening, barrels of the blue liquid, was loaded aboard as well. And the House of the Undying, that ancient place of prophecy and mystery, was left empty and silent. Korth woke to find its warlocks missing. The pureborn searched. The city guard questioned everyone who might have seen something. But the silence was already gone, vanished into the eastern seas before anyone realized what had happened. The warlocks, locked in darkness below deck, must have known that their fate was sealed. They had lived for centuries, sustained by their magic and their visions, and now they were prisoners of a madman sailing toward destinations even they could not foresee. Euron kept them alive. He needed them, not as counselors or teachers in the traditional sense, but as objects of study. He would sit with them, forcing them to drink their shade of the evening, watching what it did to them, listening to their ravings and prophecies. He learned to drink it himself, that blue poison that showed visions and madness in equal measure. The first time Euron drank shade of the evening, his crew heard him screaming from his cabin, not in pain, but in something else, something that might have been ecstasy or terror, or both at once. When he emerged the next morning, his lips were stained blue, and there was something different in his eye, something that had not been there before. The warlocks told him things. Whether those things were true, or merely the delusions of broken men desperate to survive, no one could say. But Euron listened. He absorbed every word, every vision, every scrap of forbidden knowledge they possessed. And when he had taken everything he wanted from them, when they had nothing left to offer, he did not kill them. Not right away. He kept them alive, dragging them from port to port, displaying them like trophies. "Look what I have done," he seemed to say. "Look what I have taken from the most feared sorcerers in the world." From Korth, the silence turned east again, toward lands that appeared on maps only as vague outlines and uncertain names. Ashai by the Shadowlands, places where even the Cor'in would not go, where the very air was said to be poisoned, and the night never truly ended. Most sailors believed Ashai was a myth, or, if it was real, they believed it was a place of demons and dark gods, a city built on the ruins of something older and fouler than human memory could reach. The story said that nothing grew in Ashai, that children were never born there, that those who dwelt in its black stone towers were more shadow than flesh. Euron sailed there anyway. The journey took months. The silence moved through waters that grew darker and colder, past islands where strange birds cried in languages that sounded almost human, past coastlines where the rocks themselves seemed to watch the ship pass. The crew, already mute and obedient, grew even more silent if such a thing were possible. Some of them began to go mad, their eyes wide and staring, their movements jerky and unnatural. Euron had them thrown overboard without ceremony. When the silence finally reached Ashai, what Euron found there changed him, or perhaps it simply revealed what had always been inside him, waiting for the right key to unlock it. Ashai was real, a city of black stone that drank the light, where the river ran red and the streets were filled with shadowbinders and alchemists and priests of 1,000 forgotten gods. There was no law in Asshai, no lord or king to govern it. There was only knowledge, dark knowledge, forbidden knowledge, the kind of knowledge that could drive a man mad or make him a god. Euron walked those streets for weeks, maybe months. He visited the markets where you could buy poisons that had no name, and slaves who had been broken so completely they no longer remembered they were human. He sought out the Shadowbinders, those sorcerers who worked with darkness itself, who could birth creatures of shadow and send them across the world to kill. He learned from them. He traded with them. And most importantly, he stole from them. What exactly Euron took from Asshai, what artifacts and tomes and secrets he locked away in his cabin, the full truth will never be known. But when the silence left that cursed city, it carried treasures that would have made the warlocks of Korth weep with envy or terror. There were books bound in human skin, filled with spells written in languages that predated the Valyrian freehold. There were amulets made from metals that did not exist anywhere else in the world. There were vials of liquids that glowed faintly in the dark, that whispered when you held them close to your ear, that promised power to anyone brave or foolish enough to drink them. And there was a horn. The Dragonbinder, some would call it later. Though whether that was its true name or merely a description, no one could say. It was huge, 6 feet long, made from what looked like dragon horn, but carved with Valyrian glyphs that hurt to look at. The bands around it were made of red gold and dark steel, and when you touched it, even briefly, your skin would burn. Euron claimed he found it in the ruins of Valyria itself, that he had sailed through the smoking sea and survived where thousands of others had died. But he also told that story differently at different times, changing details, adding flourishes, making it impossible to know what was truth and what was legend. What mattered was that he had it, and he believed it could bind dragons to his will. The Shadowbinders of Asshai taught Euron other things too. They taught him that blood has power, that sacrifice can open doors that remain closed to those who rely only on steel and strength, that the world is full of forces older and darker than the gods men pray to in their temples. Euron absorbed it all. He drank it in like a man dying of thirst. And somewhere in those lessons, somewhere in the black stone towers of Asshai, or the fever dreams brought on by shade of the evening, Euron began to believe that he was destined for something greater than mere piracy or kingship. He began to believe he could become a god. But godhood, even the twisted version Euron imagined, required more than knowledge. It required power. Real power. The kind of power that came from Valyria before the Doom, when dragon lords ruled the world and reshaped it according to their will. So Euron set his course for the most forbidden place in all the known world, the smoking sea, the ruins of old Valyria, the graveyard of an empire. Every sailor knew the stories. Valyria had been the greatest civilization in history, a place where magic and ambition had built wonders that made the pyramids of Gis look like children's toys. The Valyrians rode dragons. They reshaped mountains. They turned enemies into glass. Roads and built towers that reached toward the sky. And then, in a single night of fire and ash, it all ended. The doom came without warning, a cataclysm so complete that it shattered the peninsula and turned the sea itself into a boiling, poisoned wasteland. The dragons died. The dragon lords died. The slaves and the merchants and the priests, they all died, consumed by flames that burned hotter than any natural fire. What remained was death. The smoking sea still bubbled and steamed 400 years later. Ships that sailed into it were never seen again. Sailors who tried to explore the ruins came back mad or diseased or not at all. Demons walked there, people said. The ghosts of Valyria still haunted the broken towers, waiting to drag the living down into the ash. Euron sailed there anyway. He took the silence into the smoking sea, navigating by stars and instinct through waters that hissed and churned. The air was thick with ash. The sky was the colour of old blood. And all around them, rising from the poisoned water, were the ruins. Towers that had once scraped the clouds, now broken and leaning. Roads of fused dragonstone that led nowhere. Statues of dragonlords that stared with empty eyes at the ship passing below. It was beautiful and terrible, a monument to hubris and power and the price of both. How long Euron stayed in the smoking sea, what he found in those ruins, what he took and what he left behind, these are mysteries he would never fully explain. His crew, those few who survived, could not speak of it. And Euron's own stories changed every time he told them. But when the silence emerged from the smoking sea, when it sailed back into clean water under open sky, it was different. The ship looked older, somehow, weathered in ways that wind and salt could not explain. The crew looked haunted, their eyes wide and staring even in sleep. And Euron wore armour now, Valyrian steel armour, black and red, that fit him perfectly. Where he got it, whether he found it in the ruins or took it from something that still lived there, he never said, but he wore it like a second skin. And when men looked at him in that armour, with his blue-stained lips and his one eye gleaming, they saw something that was no longer quite human. The silence turned west then, away from the Shadowlands and the ruins of empires. Euron had what he came for. He had knowledge. He had artifacts. He had warlocks and dragonbinders and armour forged in the fires of old Valyria. Now it was time to go home. Time to show his brothers what he had become. Time to take what was his. The world has many forbidden places. Ruins where ancient evils sleep. Forests where travellers vanish without a trace. Mountains where the air itself can kill. But among all these cursed and dangerous lands, two stand above the rest in the nightmares of sailors and the warnings of wise men. The smoking sea, where Valyria drowned in fire and ash, and Sothorios, the green hell. Euron Greyjoy had already sailed through the first. Now he set his course for the second. But before we speak of Sothorios, we must return to the smoking sea, because what Euron claimed to have done there deserves more than a single mention. It deserves to be examined, questioned, and weighed against what we know of the world and its dangers. The doom of Valyria happened more than 400 years before the time of our story. On a single night, the entire Valyrian peninsula was destroyed by fires that erupted from the earth itself. Mountains exploded, cities vanished. The sea rushed in to fill the wounds torn in the land, and what remained was a nightmare of ash and steam and poison. In the centuries since, countless men have tried to reach the ruins. Treasure hunters seeking Valyrian steel. Adventurers hoping to claim lost knowledge. Exiled lords desperate enough to risk anything for the wealth that surely must still lie buried in the rubble. Almost none returned. And those who did return were changed. They brought diseases that had no cure. They spoke of seeing things in the smoke, shapes that moved with purpose, voices that called from empty towers. Some went mad, others died slowly, their skin turning grey and hard like stone, their minds eaten away by whatever they had breathed or touched in that cursed place. This is what Euron claimed to have survived, not once, but perhaps multiple times, if his different stories are to be believed. He said he sailed through the smoking sea when the winds were right and the gods were looking elsewhere. He said he walked on the dragon roads, those great highways of fused stone that once connected the cities of Valyria. He said he climbed into towers that still stood despite 4 centuries of fire and earthquake. And he said he found treasures. The Valyrian steel armor he wore was proof of something, at least. Valyrian steel is not made anymore. The secret died with the freehold. What remains in the world is precious beyond gold, hoarded by great houses and passed down through generations. For Euron to possess a full suit of it, not just a sword or a dagger, but actual armor, meant he had found it somewhere. Whether that somewhere was truly the ruins of Valyria or some other forgotten place, we cannot know for certain. But the armor was not the strangest thing he claimed to have taken from the smoking sea. Euron told stories, in those rare moments when he chose to speak of his travels, of finding a glass candle burning in a tower. Glass candles are another lost magic of Valyria, objects that the citadel in Old Town keeps but cannot light. They are said to allow communication across vast distances, to show visions of far-off places, to reveal truths that are hidden. The Meisters say they have not burned in 100 years or more. Euron said he saw one burning, and when he looked into its flame, he said he saw everything, the past and the future, the birth of dragons and the death of gods. He saw himself sitting on a throne made of skulls, with the world bowing before him. Whether this vision was real or simply the product of too much shade of the evening and too little sanity, only Euron could say. And Euron was not a reliable narrator of his own story. What we do know is that the silence left the smoking sea with its hold full of objects that glowed faintly in the dark, that hummed when the moon was full, that made even Euron's hardened crew uneasy. Books written in High Valyrian that described rituals no priest would dare attempt. Amulets that whispered promises of power, and that horn, the dragonbinder, wrapped in cloth and locked away where no one could touch it without Euron's permission. From Valyria, or what remained of it, Euron sailed south, far south, beyond the summer isles, beyond the shipping lanes and the trade routes, into waters that appeared on maps only as blank spaces marked with warnings and speculation. Sothorios. If Valyria was the graveyard of human ambition, Sothorios was the proof that some places were never meant for human habitation at all. It was a continent, larger than Westeros, if the map makers were to be believed, covered in jungle so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground. The heat there was crushing. The air was full of diseases that could kill in hours or days, and the jungle itself was alive with creatures that made the wolves and bears of Westeros seem tame by comparison. Basilisks as long as ships, crocodiles that could swallow a man whole, apes with fangs like daggers and the strength to tear a warrior in half, wyverns that darkened the sky when they flew, and things that had no names, that the few survivors of expeditions could only describe as nightmares given flesh. The only humans who lived in Sothorios, or so the stories said, were the brindled men, tribes of people whose skin was patterned like the pelts of jungle cats. They were said to be savage, to practice cannibalism, to worship dark gods even older than the drowned god, or the old gods of the north, and they did not welcome outsiders, But Sothorios also had ruins, ancient ruins, cities built by some long-dead civilization that had vanished before even Valyria rose to power. These ruins held artifacts and treasures that were unlike anything found elsewhere in the world. Stone idols carved with faces that did not look human. Gold worked in patterns that hurt the eye to follow. And beneath some of the ruins, in caverns and tombs sealed for thousands of years, there were objects of power that the wise feared and the foolish desired. Euron, of course, desired them. The Silence sailed along the northern coast of Sothorios, stopping at points where rivers cut through the jungle, where ancient harbours crumbled into the sea, where the ruins of cities poked through the green canopy like broken teeth. Each time, Euron would take a group of his crew inland. Each time, fewer would return. The jungle took them. Disease took them. The creatures of Sothorios took them. And sometimes something else took them. Something that left no bodies and no signs of struggle, only empty clothes and weapons lying in the mud. Euron did not mourn the losses. He simply recruited new crew members at the next port, cut out their tongues, and sailed on. What exactly he found in the ruins of Sothorios, the full inventory of what he brought back, this too is lost to uncertainty and conflicting stories. But there are fragments, pieces of the puzzle. A merchant in Volantis once claimed that Euron sold him a jade idol taken from a Sothorios temple, an object so disturbing that the merchant burned it rather than keep it in his home. A sellsword in Meereen told a story of seeing Euron with a staff made from bone, carved with symbols that predated human language, that hummed softly in the presence of magic. And there were the wyverns. The wyverns of Sothorios are not dragons. They are smaller, less intelligent, unable to breathe fire. But they can fly, and they can kill. And they respond to training in ways that true dragons never would. Euron captured wyverns, or so he claimed. He kept them in cages aboard the Silence for a time, studying them, learning their habits, trying to understand what made them different from the dragons of old. Whether he succeeded in taming them, or whether they eventually escaped or died, the stories do not agree. But years later, when Euron returned to the Iron Islands, some sailors swore they had seen great winged shapes circling above his ship, shadows against the clouds that moved with a purpose that did not seem entirely natural. The time Euron spent in the waters around Sothorios marked him in ways that went beyond the physical. The shade of the evening he had taken from the warlocks of Qarth was running low, and he began to experiment with other substances. Leaves from Sothorios plants that brought visions or madness, or both. Fungi that grew in the tombs beneath the ruined cities. Blood rituals taught to him by captured brindled men before he cut out their tongues and added them to his crew. He was searching for something. Power, yes, but something more specific. He wanted to pierce the veil between the physical world and whatever lay beyond. He wanted to see what the dead saw. He wanted to speak with gods and demons and make them answer him. And in the green darkness of Sothorios, far from any witness who could speak of what they had seen, Euron began to believe he was succeeding. His dreams, he told the few men he trusted with such confessions, were no longer his own. He dreamed of flying, of seeing the world from above like a dragon or a god. He dreamed of cities burning and oceans boiling. He dreamed of a throne made not of iron, but of screaming souls. And he sat upon it, wearing a crown of black fire. Were these dreams prophecy, or merely the delusions of a mind poisoned by too many strange substances and too much time in cursed places? Euron believed they were prophecy. He believed the gods, or whatever dark forces he had communed with, were showing him his destiny, and that destiny required him to return to Westeros. But not yet. Not until he had gathered everything he needed. Not until he was ready. From Sothrios, the Silent sailed north again, back into more familiar waters. But Euron did not stop his collecting. He raided the Basilisk Isles, taking slaves and treasures from the pirate lords who ruled there. He sailed to the Jade Sea, far to the east of any place an Ironborn had likely gone before, and brought back silks and spices and scrolls written in languages no one in Westeros could read. He visited Yiti, or so he claimed, that ancient empire of the Far East, where emperors still ruled from golden palaces and practiced arts of sorcery that the West had forgotten. He spoke of seeing a god-emperor sitting on a throne of jade, surrounded by priests who could see the future and bend reality with words alone. Whether he actually reached Yitai, or whether this was another of his exaggerations, built to make himself seem more mysterious and powerful, no one could say. But he brought back something from that journey, something he kept locked in his cabin and would show to no one. Years passed. The exact count is impossible to determine. Euron had been gone from the Iron Islands for so long that some began to believe he was dead, that the sea had finally claimed him, that his exile had become permanent in the most final way possible. But Euron was not dead. He was simply preparing. He had warlocks in his hold, kept alive through a combination of shade of the evening and pure will. He had artifacts from 12 forbidden places, each one pulsing with power that only he seemed able to sense. He had that horn, the Dragonbinder, which he believed could give him control over the greatest weapons the world had ever known. And he had knowledge, dark knowledge, forbidden knowledge, the kind of knowledge that would have had him burned as a heretic in Westeros or executed as a demon worshipper anywhere else. He knew how to break men, how to bind them to his will so completely that they would die for him without question. He knew how to work with blood and shadow, how to speak words that should not be spoken, how to make sacrifices that would appease things that were not quite gods and not quite demons. Euron Greyjoy had sailed to the edges of the world and looked over the precipice, and what he saw there did not frighten him. It inspired him. Now, with his ship full of horrors and his mind full of dark ambitions, he began to sail west, back toward the Sunset Sea, back toward the Iron Islands, because news had reached him, carried by merchants and sailors who did not realize who they were speaking to, that his brother Balon was dead. Drowned, they said, thrown from a bridge during a storm. Euron smiled when he heard that news, that same unsettling smile that had haunted his brothers since childhood. Balon had told him never to return while he lived. Well, Balon was not living any more. The condition of his exile had been lifted, and Euron had spent his years away not in regret or redemption, but in gathering the tools he would need to take what he believed was his by right. The Iron Islands had a tradition. When a king died without a clear successor, the Ironborn held a king's moot. The captains and lords would gather, and each man who wished to be king would make his case. They would boast of their deeds and their strength. They would promise plunder and glory. And then the Ironborn would choose. Victarion was there, strong and loyal and respected, but limited in vision, unable to see beyond the old way and the traditions that had governed the islands for centuries. Asha was there too, Balon's daughter, clever and capable, but facing the prejudice of men who did not believe a woman could lead them to war. And now Euron was coming, with his black sails and his mute crew, with his Valyrian armor and his dragonbinder horn, with all the dark knowledge and twisted power he had gathered from the shadow places of the world. The Kingsmoot would choose a king. But Euron hadn't sailed to the edge of the world and back just to be chosen by lesser men. He had sailed there to become something more than a king. And the Iron Islands and all of Westeros beyond them were about to learn what that meant. The silence cut through the waters of the Sunset Sea, bearing west toward Pike. Behind it, in the ship's wake, the sea was dark and still, as if even the water itself was holding its breath, waiting for what came next. The Iron Islands are a place where news travels slowly. There are no ravens that fly reliably through the constant storms. There are no roads connecting the islands, only the sea, and the sea does not care about messages or urgency. When something happens on one island, it might be days or weeks before the other islands know. But when Euron Greyjoy died, the news spread faster than anyone expected. He fell from a rope bridge during a storm, they said. The bridge connected two of Pike's towers, swaying high above the rocks and the crashing waves. Balon had crossed it 1,000 times. He knew its dangers. He knew to be careful. But on that night, in that storm, something went wrong. The bridge gave way, or Balon slipped, or the wind caught him at just the wrong moment. He fell. And when they found his body the next morning, broken on the rocks below, there was no doubt that the Lord of the Iron Islands was dead. His brother Euron, the Damphair, performed the rites. He spoke the prayers to the drowned god. He consigned Balon's body to the sea, as was proper for an Ironborn lord. And then he called for a Kingsmoot. The Kingsmoot was an ancient tradition, older than the Targaryen conquest, older perhaps than any written history of the islands. When a king died without a clear successor, the captains and the lords would gather on the island of Old Wick, at a place called Naga's Hill. There, beneath the bones of a sea dragon that might have been real or might have been legend, they would choose their next king. It had been thousands of years since the last Kingsmoot. The tradition had fallen away, replaced by simple inheritance from father to son. But Euron insisted. Balon's sons were dead, killed in the failed rebellion against Robert Baratheon. His only surviving child was Asha, a woman, and while she was capable and respected, many Ironborn would not follow a female ruler. There would be claimants, there would be arguments, there would be a need for the old ways to settle the matter. And so the call went out across the Iron Islands. Every captain with a longship, every lord with a hall, every man who considered himself worthy to have a voice in choosing the next king. They were to gather at Old Wick when the moon was full. Euron Greyjoy heard the call aboard his flagship, the Iron Victory. He was the Lord Captain of the Iron Fleet, the strongest naval commander the islands had. He was Balon's brother, blood of the Kraken, a man who had led raids and won battles and never once turned away from a fight. He did not want to be king. The responsibility weighed on him even as a thought. But duty demanded that he at least be present. And in the back of his mind, in the place where pride lived, he wondered if perhaps the captains might choose him. Not because he sought power, but because he was strong and loyal and true to the drowned god. Asha Greyjoy heard the call on Harlaw, where she had been gathering support among her mother's kin. She was Balon's daughter, his only surviving child. By the laws of the Greenlands, the laws of Westeros proper, she would be his heir. But the Iron Islands did not always follow those laws. Here, strength mattered more than birth order. Here, a woman had to prove herself twice over to earn half the respect a man received. Asha was clever. She knew she faced long odds, but she also knew that she understood the islands better than any of her uncles. She knew that the old way, the way of reaving and raiding, had brought nothing but disaster to her people. Balon's rebellion had cost them thousands of lives and gained them nothing. If the Ironborn were to survive, they needed to adapt. They needed to be smarter. She would make that case at the Kingsmoot, and she would hope it was enough. And then there was Euron. The silence appeared off the coast of Pike 3 days before the Kingsmoot was to begin. The watchmen on the towers saw it coming from miles away, those black sails unmistakable against the grey sky. At first, they thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow on the water that would vanish when the sun shifted. But the shadow did not vanish. It grew larger. And as it drew closer to the harbour, the men on the walls began to recognize what they were seeing. Euron Greyjoy had come home. Word spread through Pike like wildfire. Euron, who had been gone for years. Euron, who had been exiled by Balon. Euron, who was supposed to never return while his brother lived. He was here, and he was sailing straight for the castle as if he owned it. Some men were afraid. They remembered the stories. The boy who drowned his brother for fun, the captain who cut out the tongues of his crew, the rumours that had filtered back over the years from Essos and beyond, tales of black sails and blue-lipped corpses and ships that vanished in the night. Others were curious. Euron had been gone so long that he had become almost a legend. And legends, when they return, are always worth seeing. The Silence docked in Lordsport, and Euron stepped onto the pier wearing his Valyrian steel armour. It was black as midnight with red enamel, flowing and beautiful, and clearly worth more than most lords would earn in a lifetime. He wore a patch over one eye, black leather, that somehow made his remaining eye seem brighter, more unsettling. And his lips were stained blue. The crowd that had gathered to see him arrive fell silent. This was not the Euron they remembered. This was something else, something that had been forged in distant lands and shaped by experiences they could not imagine. Euron smiled at them, and then he began to walk toward the castle, his mute crew following behind him in perfect silence. Euron was waiting at Pike, the damp hair, the holy man, the priest who spoke for the drowned god. When he saw Euron approaching, when he saw that smile and those blue lips and that single eye gleaming with something that might have been madness or might have been certainty, he felt terror grip his heart. This was his brother. The brother who had tortured him as a child, the brother who had laughed while holding him under the water, the brother he had spent his entire adult life trying to forget. Euron tried to speak, tried to challenge Euron, to demand to know why he had returned when Balon's exile still hung over him. But the words caught in his throat. Sind. Euron simply walked past him, into the castle, as if the damper were nothing more than a servant. Victarion was there too. And when he saw Euron, his face hardened. He remembered. He remembered his wife. He remembered the humiliation. He remembered the rage that had driven him to kill the woman he loved, rather than kill his own brother. But Victarion was a practical man. Euron was here. There was nothing to be done about it now. and in 3 days, at the Kingsmoot, the matter would be settled. The captains would choose, and whoever they chose would be king. Victarion did not believe they would choose Euron. The Ironborn valued strength and honour. Euron had neither, not in the way the islands understood those terms. He was too strange, too foreign, too touched by the madness of far-off places. Victarion was wrong. The day of the Kingsmoot dawned grey and cold. The captains gathered on Oldwick, hundreds of them, standing beneath the ribs of Naga. The bones arced overhead like the roof of some ancient cathedral, bleached white by centuries of sun and salt. Aaron stood before them and spoke the ancient words, calling on the drowned god to guide their choice. And then he asked, who would be king? Several men came forward, lesser lords, men with small followings, making their cases more out of pride than any real belief they would be chosen. The crowd listened politely, and then dismissed them. Then Victarion stepped forward. He spoke simply. He reminded them that he was the Lord Captain of the Iron Fleet, that he had led them to victory in battle, that he was strong and loyal and true to the old gods. He promised them glory. He promised them that under his rule the Iron Islands would be respected and feared. The crowd cheered. Many of the captains clearly favoured him. Victarion was one of their own, a man they understood, a man who embodied the values they prized. Then Asha stepped forward. She was bold in her speech, mocking her uncles gently, reminding the crowd that she was Balin's blood more directly than any of them. She promised wisdom instead of reckless glory. She spoke of the dangers of repeating her father's mistakes, of throwing away Ironborn lives in rebellions that could not be won. Some cheered for her, others grumbled. A woman king was difficult for many to accept, no matter how clever she might be. And then Euron came forward. He did not walk, he strode, his Valyrian armour catching what little light broke through the clouds. He climbed onto a rock so everyone could see him clearly. And then he began to speak. His voice was smooth, confident. He spoke of his travels, of the places he had been and the things he had seen. He described Qarth and Ashai, Valyria and Sothorios, painting pictures with his words that made even hardened warriors lean forward to listen. And then he made his promises. He would give them the world, he said. Not just the Iron Islands, not just a few coastal holdings on Westeros. He would give them all of it. Oldtown, King's Landing. The entire 7 kingdoms would bow before the Ironborn, and they would take what they wanted as the old way demanded. The crowd stirred. These were bold words, impossible words. But Euron spoke them with such certainty that some began to believe. Then Euron signalled to his crew. They brought forth chests and opened them before the crowd. Gold spilled out. Jewels caught the light. Silks and rare objects from across the known world were displayed for all to see. This, Euron said, was just a taste. This was what he had taken during his exile. Imagine what they could take together. The crowd was impressed, but they had seen wealth before. They needed more than promises and plunder. Euron gave them more. His crew brought forth the dragon horn. It was massive, longer than a man, covered in Valyrian glyphs that seemed to writhe when you looked at them directly. The metal bands around it gleamed red and black. This, Euron said, was a dragon binder, a horn from old Valyria that could control dragons. And he had it. He possessed the tool that would let the Ironborn command the greatest weapons in the world. He ordered one of his men to blow it. The man put the horn to his lips and blew. The sound that came out was like nothing the Ironborn had ever heard. It was deep and terrible, a noise that vibrated in the chest and made the bones of Naga seem to tremble. It was a sound of power and of doom. The man who blew the horn collapsed. His lips were blackened, his eyes were wide, and when they checked, they found he was dead. The crowd was silent. They had just witnessed something beyond their understanding. Magic. Real magic. Not the vague blessings of the drowned god or the whispers of the old gods, but power you could see and hear and fear. Euron smiled. He told them that dragons were returning to the world. In Meereen, across the narrow sea, a silver-haired queen had hatched 3 dragons from stone, and Euron had the tool to take those dragons from her, to bind them to Ironborn will. With dragons, he said, nothing could stand against them. The 7 kingdoms would burn or bow, and the Ironborn would rule as they were meant to rule, as masters of the sea and the sky. The crowd erupted, some in fear, some in excitement, some in disbelief. But all of them were moved. All of them had heard something they could not ignore. Aeron tried to object. He called Euron godless. He said the drowned god would never bless a man who dealt in dark magic and foreign sorcery. He said Euron was cursed, damned, a bringer of doom, rather than glory. But his voice was drowned out by the roar of the crowd, because Euron had done what neither Victarion nor Asher could do. He had given them hope. Not reasonable hope. Not the careful planning of wise leaders, but the wild, intoxicating hope of men who had been told they could have everything they ever wanted. The captains voted. Not all of them. Not unanimously, but enough. More than enough. Euron Greyjoy was chosen to sit the Seastone chair. Euron Greyjoy was chosen to be king of the Iron Islands. And as the cheers rose around him, as his name was shouted to the grey sky, Euron stood on that rock and smiled. He had been gone for years. He had sailed to the edge of the world and back. He had gathered power and knowledge and tools that no Ironborn had ever possessed. And now he had returned to claim what he believed was always meant to be his. The Iron Islands had a new king. But what they had truly gained was something darker, something that would bring them glory or ruin, or perhaps both at once. Euron Greyjoy had come home, and the world would soon learn to fear what that meant. Victarion stood in the crowd, his fists clenched, his jaw tight. He had been passed over. His brother, the brother he hated, the brother who had destroyed his marriage and brought shame to their house, was now his king. But Victarion was a loyal man. He would serve. He would obey, even if it killed him. Asha watched from the edge of the gathering. She had lost. She had made her case, and it had not been enough. Now she would have to decide whether to bend the knee to her uncle or to resist him, and face the consequences. And Aeron, the damp hair, stood trembling. He saw in Euron everything he feared: the godless man, the sorcerer, the brother who had tortured him as a child and who now wore a crown. He prayed to the drowned god for guidance, for protection, for some sign that this nightmare would end. But the only answer he received was the sound of the waves crashing against the rocks. And in that sound, if he listened closely, he might have heard something that sounded almost like laughter. A king without a kingdom is just a man with a title. Euron Greyjoy understood this better than most. He had won the Kingsmoot. He sat the Seastone chair. The Ironborn called him king and bent their knees before him. But the Iron Islands were small and poor, a collection of rocks in the sea, that could barely feed their own people, let alone support the grand ambitions Euron had promised. He needed to prove himself. He needed to show the captains who had chosen him that their faith was not misplaced. He needed plunder and glory and victories that would make songs. And he needed to begin building towards something greater. The first thing Euron did as king was deal with those who opposed him. Asha had bent the knee, reluctantly, but she had done it. She was family, and she was clever enough to know when a fight could not be won. Euron accepted her submission and largely left her alone, though he kept her close enough to watch. Victarion was a different matter. Victarion had also bent the knee, out of duty and tradition, but Euron could see the hatred burning in his brother's eyes. That hatred was useful. Hatred could be directed. Hatred could be exploited. So Euron gave Victarion a mission. He gave him the Iron Fleet, the greatest naval force the islands possessed, and he ordered him to sail to Meereen, to the far side of the world, to find the Dragon Queen Daenerys Targaryen and bring her back to Westeros. It was a suicide mission wrapped in the guise of an honor. Meereen was thousands of miles away. The journey would take months, maybe a year or more. The chances of success were slim, the chances of Victarion surviving even slimmer. But Euron presented it as a great quest. He gave Victarion the Dragonbinder horn and told him it would let him control the dragons. He promised that if Victarion succeeded, if he brought the Dragon Queen back to wed Euron, then Victarion would be remembered as the greatest captain in Ironborn history. Victarion believed him. Or perhaps Victarion simply wanted to believe. Either way, he took the fleet and sailed east, away from the Iron Islands, away from Euron's plans, away from everything that was about to happen, which was exactly what Euron wanted. With Victarion gone, with the Iron Fleet scattered across the eastern seas, Euron turned his attention to the rest of his captains. He gathered them in the Great Hall at Pike and laid out his vision. They would raid the Reach, the richest, most fertile region of Westeros, the land of golden fields and fat merchants, of castles filled with treasures and small folk who had never known real war. The Reach had been untouched during Robert's rebellion and the wars that followed. It was ripe for the taking. But Euron was not interested in small raids. He was not interested in hitting a few coastal villages and running away with whatever they could carry. He wanted to strike at the heart of the Reach's power. He wanted to seize territory and hold it. He wanted to make the lords of Westeros understand that the Iron Islands were no longer a minor annoyance, but a real threat. His target was the Shield Islands. The Shield Islands were 4 islands that sat off the coast of the Reach, guarding the mouth of the Manda River. They were held by 4 lordly houses, sworn to the Tyrells of Highgarden. The islands were not particularly wealthy, but they were strategically vital. They protected the shipping lanes. They guarded the approaches to Old Town and Highgarden, and they were a symbol of the Reach's dominance over the western coast. Taking the Shield Islands would be more than a raid. It would be a conquest, a statement. And Euron intended to make that statement as loudly as possible. He gathered his fleet. Not the Iron Fleet, which was gone with Victarion, but every other longship the Iron Islands could muster. 100 ships. 200. The exact count varied depending on who was telling the story, but what mattered was that it was a force large enough to overwhelm the defences of the Shield Islands. And Euron did not just bring warriors, he brought his warlocks, those broken men from Korth who he kept chained in the hold of the Silence. He brought his priests, holy men he had captured from 12 different faiths, all of them bound and gagged and terrified. He brought the strange artifacts he had collected during his years of exile, objects that pulsed with power and made even hardened Ironborn uneasy. He was preparing for something beyond simple conquest. But he told no one exactly what that was. The attack on the Shield Islands came without warning. The lords there had grown comfortable in their holdings. They had small garrisons, just enough to deter pirates and bandits. They never expected a full Ironborn fleet to descend on them like a storm. The first island fell in a single day. The Ironborn landed on the beaches and swept through the defenders like a wave. The lord of the island, an old man named Grim, tried to rally his men, but was cut down in the fighting. His castle was taken. His treasures were looted. His people were put to the sword or taken as thralls. The second and third islands followed quickly. The defenders sent ravens to Highgarden begging for help. But by the time any aid could arrive, the fighting was already over. The Ironborn were too fast, too vicious, too overwhelming. The fourth island held out longer. Its lord, Seri, was younger and more capable. He managed to hold his castle for 3 days, raining arrows down on the Ironborn and making them pay for every foot of ground. But in the end, it did not matter. Euron brought forth his warlocks and his priests, and strange things began to happen. Men reported seeing shadows moving independently of any light source. They spoke of hearing voices that came from nowhere, whispering in languages they did not understand. Some claimed the sea itself turned against them, waves rising up to smash against the castle walls as if directed by some unseen hand. Whether these were true magics or simply the fear and exhaustion of men under siege, the effect was the same. The defenders' morale broke. The castle fell, and Lord Seri was dragged before Euron in chains. Euron did not kill him, not immediately. Instead, he made Seri an offer. Bend the knee, swear loyalty to the Ironborn, help us hold these islands against the Reach's inevitable counterattack, and you will live. You will even keep your title, though you will serve a new master. Seri refused. He cursed Euron as a demon and a madman. He swore that the Tyrells would come with fire and steel, that the entire Reach would rise up to drive the Ironborn back into the sea. Euron smiled at that, and then he had Seri drowned. Not in the way the Ironborn drowned their own, in the ritual of the drowned god, where sometimes the drowned man was brought back. No. Euron had Seri tied to a post at the waterline and left there as the tide came in. It took hours. The Lord screamed and begged, and finally went silent as the water covered his head. Euron watched the whole thing, and when it was done, he turned to the other captive lords and asked if anyone else wished to refuse his offer. None did. The Shield Islands were renamed. Euron gave them new, Ironborn names and installed his own men as their lords. These were not great lords, not men of ancient lineage. They were captains who had proven themselves in the fighting, men who owed everything to Euron and would remain loyal out of gratitude and fear. But holding the islands was only the beginning. Euron's true target lay farther up the coast. Old Town, the second largest city in Westeros, the seat of House Hightower, the home of the Citadel where maesters were trained, the centre of learning and religion in the Seven Kingdoms. Euron intended to burn it all. But first, he needed to secure his position. The Reach would respond to the loss of the Shield Islands. the Tyrells would send armies. The Redwynes, who controlled the largest fleet in the Reach, would come with their warships. Euron welcomed this. He wanted them to come, because he had a plan. The Redwyne fleet was the pride of the Reach, hundreds of ships commanded by Paxter Redwyne, a capable and cautious lord. They had been occupied during the War of the Five Kings, supporting the Lannisters and blockading Dragonstone. But now that war was ending, and the Redwynes were free to return home, Euron set a trap for them. He scattered his fleet among the Shield Islands, hiding ships in coves and behind rocky outcroppings. He made it look like the Ironborn were divided, vulnerable, easy prey for a coordinated attack. And when the Redwyne fleet approached, confident in their numbers and their seamanship, Euron sprang the trap. The Ironborn surged out from their hiding places, surrounding the Redwyne ships, cutting off their escape routes. What followed was a massacre. The Redwynes fought bravely, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Their ships were boarded, their crews were killed or captured, and by the time the sun set, more than half the Redwyne fleet was burning or sinking into the sea. Paxter Redwyne himself was taken prisoner. Euron had him brought to the Silence, and there, in the dim light of his cabin, he made the Lord an offer. Order your remaining ships to stand down. Swear that you will not oppose the Ironborn. Do this, and you will live. Your family will live. Your holdings will remain intact. Redwyn, bloodied and exhausted, agreed. What else could he do? His fleet was destroyed. His men were dead or captured. Resistance would only bring more death. Euron accepted his oath and then locked him away. Not in a dungeon, but in a cabin aboard one of the captured ships, guarded day and night. A hostage of value. A piece to be used later. With the Redwyne fleet broken and the Shield Islands secure, Euron's position was stronger than any Ironborn king in generations. He controlled the western coast. He threatened Oldtown and the mouth of the Mander. And he had proven that the Ironborn, under his leadership, could do more than raid and run. But Euron was not satisfied. He never could be. Because his ambitions reached far beyond holding a few islands or extracting tribute from frightened lords, he began to gather people, not warriors, not captains, people of a different kind, holy men, priests and septons and godswives, anyone who claimed to speak for the gods, who wore the symbols of faith and led prayers. Euron's men raided coastal villages and sacked septs, dragging the holy men back to the ships. They did not kill them. They kept them alive, bound and gagged, locked in the holds. Euron also took highborn captives, lords and ladies from the Reach, who had the misfortune of being in the wrong place when the Ironborn came. He treated them with a strange courtesy, feeding them well and keeping them in relative comfort. But he did not ransom them. He did not release them. He simply kept them, adding to his collection. The Ironborn did not understand what their king was doing. They had won great victories. They had seized territory and broken enemy fleets. But instead of pressing their advantage, instead of raiding deeper into the Reach or fortifying their position, Euron seemed to be gathering prisoners for no clear purpose. Some captains began to mutter. Some began to question. Euron was strange, they said. Too strange. His promises of dragons and glory were empty words. He was leading them toward something dark and terrible, something that would bring the wrath of gods and men alike. Euron heard these whispers, and he did nothing to stop them. Because doubt was useful. Doubt kept men on edge, kept them from growing too comfortable, too complacent. And besides, he would prove himself soon enough. When Old Town burned, when dragons flew at his command, when the world itself bent to his will, Valyria Flowers was a bastard daughter of Lord Humphrey Hewitt, one of the lords of the Shield Islands. She was young and beautiful and entirely unprepared for what was about to happen to her. When the Ironborn took her father's castle, they brought her before Euron. And Euron, with his charm and his promises, seduced her. He told her she would be his queen. He told her she would sit beside him when he ruled the 7 kingdoms. He gave her gifts and attention, and made her believe that she was special, chosen, beloved. And Valyria believed him. She wanted to believe him, because believing was easier than accepting that she was a prisoner, a plaything, a tool in the hands of a madman. Euron married her, or rather, he went through a mockery of a marriage ceremony, performed by a drunken septon he had captured. There were no witnesses, except his crew, no legitimacy in the eyes of the 7 or any other gods. But he called her his queen, and for a brief time, Valyria thought her life had become a fairy tale. Then she made the mistake of becoming pregnant. Euron's interest in her vanished overnight. She was moved from his cabin to a cell. The gifts stopped. The attention stopped. She was just another captive now, valuable only for what was growing inside her. And when she asked what would happen to her child, when she asked if Euron would acknowledge the baby, he laughed. That terrible laugh that had haunted his brothers since childhood. He told her the child would serve a purpose, a greater purpose than she could understand, and that should be enough for her. Valyria Flowers learned too late that Euron Greyjoy did not love. He did not cherish. He only used. And when something was no longer useful, he discarded it without a second thought. The Ironborn held the Shield Islands. They controlled the western coast of the Reach. They had broken the Red Wine Fleet and captured lords and holy men and pregnant women. And Euron stood at the prow of the Silence, staring north toward Old Town, his one eye gleaming with anticipation. He had promised the Ironborn dragons and glory. He had promised them the world. And he intended to deliver, no matter what it cost. No matter who had to burn, no matter how many souls had to be sacrificed to the dark powers he served. The war was just beginning, and the worst was yet to come. The world turns on the choices of powerful men. Kings decide when armies march. Lords decide who lives and who dies in their domains. Priests decide what the gods demand and what sacrifices must be made. But sometimes a man comes along who does not simply make choices within the world as it exists. He tries to reshape the world itself. He tries to break it and remake it according to his own vision. Euron Greyjoy was such a man. By the end of A Dance with Dragons, the 5th book in the Song of Ice and Fire series, Euron's position was stronger than any Ironborn leader in living memory. He held the Shield Islands. He threatened Old Town, the greatest city in the Reach. He had broken the Red Wine Fleet and taken hostages of value. His black sails were feared along the entire western coast of Westeros. But these victories, impressive as they were not the end of his ambitions. They were barely the beginning. Euron had gathered holy men, dozens of them, septons and septors from the faith of the 7, red priests who worshipped R'hllor, the Lord of Light, even a few followers of stranger gods, deities whose names weren't widely known in Westeros. He kept them locked in the holds of his ships, bound and gagged, waiting. The Ironborn did not understand why. Hostages were valuable for ransom or exchange. Warriors were valuable for their strength. But holy men, what use were priests and priestesses except to perform rituals and speak blessings? Euron knew. He had always known. Because in his years of exile, in his travels to Karth and Ashai and the ruins of Valyria, he had learned things that most men never dreamed of. He had learned that blood has power, that sacrifice opens doors, that the gods, if they existed at all, could be bargained with or commanded or even replaced, and he intended to prove it. Oldtown sat at the mouth of the Honeywine River, a city of white stone and tall towers, dominated by the High Tower itself. The High Tower was ancient, older than the Targaryen conquest, older perhaps than any structure in Westeros except the Wall. It rose 800 feet into the sky, topped by a great beacon that could be seen for miles. At night the beacon burned, guiding ships safely to harbour. The city was home to the Citadel, where Maesters were trained. It was home to the Starry Sept, the centre of the faith before the construction of the Great Sept of Baelor in King's Landing. It was a city of learning and religion, of scholars and priests, of accumulated knowledge that stretched back thousands of years. Euron wanted to burn it all. Not out of hatred for learning or religion, though he had little respect for either. No, Euron wanted to burn Oldtown because it represented everything he despised: order, tradition, the careful preservation of the past, the belief that knowledge should be hoarded and controlled by institutions rather than seized by those strong enough to take it. And because burning Oldtown would make a statement. It would tell the world that Euron Greyjoy was not just another pirate king. He was something far more dangerous. But Oldtown was well defended. House Hightower was ancient and wealthy. They had armies and walls and the resources to withstand a siege. A direct assault would be costly, perhaps impossible. Euron needed an advantage, something that would tilt the balance in his favour. He needed magic. In the days leading up to his planned assault on Oldtown, Euron began to perform rituals, dark rituals, sacrifices. He took his holy men, those priests and septons he had gathered, and he had them brought to the deck of the Silence, one by one. What happened to them is not fully described in the books, because the books are told from the perspectives of characters who were not there to witness it. But we can piece together fragments from what other characters saw and heard. We know that screams echoed across the water at night. We know that the sea around Euron's fleet turned strange colours, red and black and purple, as if something was seeping up from the depths. We know that some of his own men began to go mad, speaking in tongues, seeing visions, throwing themselves overboard in terror. And we know that Euron's collection of artifacts, those strange objects he had gathered from across the world, began to pulse with light and energy. He was working towards something, a great spell, a ritual of such power that it would reshape reality itself. Or so he believed. Among the captives Euron held was Valyria Flowers, his supposed queen, now heavy with child. She had been kept alive for this moment, because Euron needed royal blood for his sacrifice. It did not matter that she was a bastard, that her claim to nobility was tenuous at best. What mattered was that she believed she was carrying a king's child, and in the twisted logic of blood magic, belief was almost as important as reality. Valyria's fate is not explicitly shown in the published books, but the implications are clear and terrible. She was to be part of the sacrifice. Her unborn child was to be part of it. Euron would take their blood and their lives and use them to fuel whatever dark working he was attempting. This is the depth of Euron's madness. This is the proof that he had become something beyond human, something that viewed people not as individuals with hopes and fears, but as tools to be used and discarded. The Ironborn who served him were beginning to realize this. Some had suspected it for years, but now the truth was undeniable. Their king was not leading them to glory. He was leading them to damnation. But it was too late to turn back. They had followed him this far. They had committed atrocities in his name. They had broken the laws of gods and men. There was no redemption waiting for them, no path back to normalcy. They could only follow Euron to whatever end he had planned. And that end, Euron promised, would be glorious. Now we must step back from the narrative and acknowledge something important. What we have discussed so far is what is confirmed or strongly implied in the published books of A Song of Ice and Fire. But there is much about Euron's plans that remains uncertain, because George R.R. Martin has not yet published the final books in the series. What follows now is speculation, theory, the interpretations that fans and readers have developed based on the clues Martin has left in the text. These theories must be clearly labelled as such because they are not canon. They are possibilities, educated guesses about where Euron's story might be heading. One of the most popular and disturbing theories about Euron is that he intends to become a god. Not metaphorically, not as a title or an aspiration, but literally. He believes he can ascend to godhood through the rituals he is performing, through the sacrifices he is making, through the power he is gathering. The evidence for this theory comes from several sources. In the books, Euron speaks of seeing himself on a throne surrounded by skulls, with the world bowing before him. He drinks shade of the evening constantly, experiencing visions that he treats as prophecies. He has gathered artifacts from Valyria and Ashai, objects associated with the height of magical power in the world's history. And there are hints, subtle but present, that Euron believes the gods themselves can be overthrown or replaced. He mocks the drowned god. He shows no fear of the Seven or R'hllor or any other deity. He seems to view them not as all-powerful beings, but as forces that can be challenged, bargained with, or even absorbed. Some readers believe Euron is attempting to trigger a second doom. The original doom of Valyria destroyed the greatest civilization in history. It shattered the peninsula and killed millions. But it also released vast amounts of magical energy. What if Euron believes he can harness that energy? What if he thinks that by causing a similar cataclysm in Westeros, centered on Oldtown, or some other place of power, he can absorb enough magic to transcend mortality? This theory is speculative, but it fits with what we know of Euron's character. He is not content with earthly power. He wants more. He always wants more. Another theory concerns the Dragonbinder horn. Euron gave this horn to Victarion and sent him to Meereen to fetch Daenerys Targaryen and her dragons. But many readers believe this is a trap, that Euron never intended for Victarion to succeed, or, if he did succeed, that the horn would give Euron control over the dragons, not Victarion. The evidence for this comes from the nature of Valyrian magic. Objects like the Dragonbinder are not simple tools. They are bound with spells and conditions. When the horn was blown at the Kingsmoot, the man who blew it died instantly, his lungs charred from within. This suggests that using the horn requires a sacrifice, that there is always a price. Some believe that Victarion, in his simple faith and loyalty, will attempt to use the horn without understanding its true nature, and when he does, it will not give him control of the dragons. Instead, it will bind the dragons to Euron, who is thousands of miles away but connected to the horn through some Valyrian spell. This would be perfectly in character for Euron. To send his brother on a quest to let Victarion believe he is acting with agency and purpose, and then to steal everything at the final moment. To prove, once again, that Euron is always 3 steps ahead, always manipulating, always winning. But this too is speculation. We do not know for certain what the Dragonbinder will do, or how the confrontation between Victarion and Daenerys will play out. There is also the question of Euron's ultimate goal. If he conquers Oldtown, if he gains control of dragons, if he performs his dark rituals and gains unimaginable power, what then? What does he actually want? Some readers believe Euron wants to rule Westeros as a traditional king, but with overwhelming force. That makes resistance impossible. Others believe he wants to destroy Westeros entirely, to bring about an apocalypse that will remake the world in his image. And some believe that Euron's goals are more abstract, that he is driven not by a desire for any specific outcome, but by a need to prove that he is beyond human limits, beyond morality, beyond the constraints that bind other men. That his entire life has been a journey toward transcendence, and everything he does is in service of that journey. The truth is, we do not know. George R.R. Martin has seeded the text with clues and foreshadowing, but he has not revealed the full picture. And until the final books are published, perhaps never, we can only speculate. What we do know is that Euron represents something unique in the story of A Song of Ice and Fire. Most of the antagonists in the series are comprehensible. Tywin Lannister wants power and legacy for his house. Cersei wants to protect her children and maintain her position. Ramsay Bolton is a sadist, but his cruelty is almost mundane in its motives. Euron is different. He is a void. A man who has looked into the darkest corners of the world and come back wanting to become darkness itself. He does not want to rule the world as it is. He wants to break it and reshape it, and he has the knowledge, the tools, and the utter lack of conscience required to try. The Ironborn who follow him are beginning to understand this. They see the sacrifices, they hear the screams, they feel the wrongness that permeates the air around Euron's fleet, and they are afraid. But fear is not enough to make them rebel, because Euron has given them victories. He has made them rich, he has made them powerful, and some part of them, the part that still believes in the old way and the glory of taking what you want, believes that Euron might actually succeed. That if they follow him just a little farther, if they endure just a little more horror, they will be rewarded with everything he has promised. Dragons, kingdoms, glory that will echo through the ages. They are wrong, of course. Euron's promises are lies, not in the sense that he does not believe them, but in the sense that even if he succeeds, even if he gains everything he seeks, his followers will not share in it. They are tools to him, nothing more. And when tools are no longer needed, they are discarded. Euron Greyjoy, the Damper, understands this better than most. He is Euron's brother. He knows what Euron is capable of. And in the chapters featuring Euron in the later books, we see him descending into a kind of prophetic madness, experiencing visions of apocalypse and doom. Euron sees a rusted iron throne with Euron sitting upon it, crowned and terrible. He sees the world drowned in blood. He sees creatures from nightmares walking the earth. And he realizes, perhaps too late, that Euron is not just a threat to the Reach or to Westeros. He is a threat to existence itself. But Aeron is a prisoner now, chained in the hold of the Silence, kept alive for reasons he does not fully understand, though he suspects he too will be part of Euron's sacrifice. And all he can do is pray to the drowned god and hope that someone, somewhere, will stop his brother before it is too late. The question that haunts readers is this: can Euron be stopped? He has power, he has knowledge, he has artifacts from the height of the world's magical civilizations. He has dragons, or will have them soon if his plans succeed, and he has absolutely no moral constraints, no lines he will not cross, no atrocity he will not commit in pursuit of his goals. The heroes of A Song of Ice and Fire are scattered and weakened. Jon Snow is dead or dying at the Wall. Daenerys is lost in the Dothraki Sea. Tyrion is in exile. The Stark children are scattered across the world. And the lords of Westeros are more concerned with fighting each other than with the threat growing in the west. Euron might actually win. Or, at least, he might succeed in causing enough destruction that the world is fundamentally changed by his actions. This is what makes him such a terrifying antagonist. Most villains in fiction are constrained by some logic, some rules. They want power, or revenge, or to protect something they value. And those motivations make them predictable. They make them possible to defeat. Euron wants to become a god, and there is no playbook for stopping someone with that ambition. As we reach the end of this journey through Euron Greyjoy's life and crimes, we must acknowledge the incomplete nature of his story. The books have not yet revealed his final fate. We do not know if he will succeed or fail. We do not know if his rituals will work, or if they will backfire. We do not know if someone will kill him, or if he will destroy himself, or if he will actually achieve something close to what he desires. What we do know is that Euron Greyjoy represents one of the darkest threads in A Song of Ice and Fire. He is a man who has rejected every value that makes civilization possible. Mercy, compassion, honor, love, even basic human decency. He has replaced all of it with a single-minded pursuit of power and transcendence. And in doing so, he has become something monstrous. The Iron Islands produced him. The Ironborn culture, with its emphasis on strength and taking what you want, created the conditions for someone like Euron to emerge. But Euron transcended even that harsh culture. He took its worst aspects and amplified them, added to them the forbidden knowledge of distant lands, and created something new and terrible. The boy who drowned his brother for fun became the man who would drown the world if it served his purposes. The captain who cut out his crew's tongues became the king who cuts out the tongue of reason itself, who silences any voice that might question his vision. The exile who sailed to the edge of the world became the conqueror, who wants to push the world over that edge and see what lies beyond. This is Euron Greyjoy, the Crow's Eye, the king of the Iron Islands, the terror of the Sunset Sea. And his story, whatever its ending may be, is one of the most chilling in all of Westeros. If you have followed Euron's journey through these chapters, if you have walked with him from the cold halls of Pike to the burning ruins of Valyria, to the decks of the Silence as it approaches Old Town, then you have seen what happens when ambition is untempered by conscience, when intelligence is unguided by morality, when power is pursued without any thought for the cost. Euron is a warning, not a subtle one, not a gentle one, but a warning nonetheless. He is what we become when we stop seeing other people as human, when we start seeing them as obstacles or tools or sacrifices, when we convince ourselves that our goals, whatever they may be, justify any means of achieving them. The world of A Song of Ice and Fire is full of grey characters, people who do terrible things for understandable reasons, people who struggle with impossible choices, people who are neither purely good nor purely evil. Euron is different. He has crossed so many lines, committed so many atrocities, that whatever humanity he once possessed is gone. He's a monster wearing the shape of a man, and the only question is how much damage he will do before someone stops him. As we conclude this exploration of Euron's life and crimes, consider sharing your own thoughts. Do you believe Euron will succeed in his mad ambitions? Do you think the theories about his godhood are correct? Or is there some other explanation for his actions? And who, if anyone, has the power to stop him before he brings about the apocalypse he seems to desire? The world of ice and fire has faced many threats: dragons and White Walkers, mad kings and would-be conquerors. But few have been as purely malevolent, as completely unconstrained by morality or reason as Euron Greyjoy, and that makes him one of the most important characters in the entire saga. Not because he is heroic or sympathetic, but because he represents the ultimate question that George R.R. Martin poses to his readers. What happens when someone with no limits, no conscience, and no fear gains access to ultimate power? We may yet find out, if the final books are ever published, if Euron's story reaches its conclusion, if the world of Westeros survives long enough to see whether the Crow's Eye was a prophet, or just another madman who flew too close to the sun. Until then, we can only watch the horizon. And when we see black sails against the setting sun, we can only hope that someone, somewhere, is ready to stand against the storm that is coming. Because Euron Greyjoy is that storm, and he will not stop until the world is remade in his image or destroyed in the attempt. The story of Euron Greyjoy is not yet finished. The books remain incomplete. The final chapters have not been written. And so we are left with a character who exists in a state of terrible potential, a storm gathering on the horizon that has not yet broken. But even without an ending, even without knowing his ultimate fate, Euron's journey tells us something important about the world of ice and fire. It tells us that in a story full of moral complexity, full of characters who struggle between duty and desire, honor and survival, there is still room for something darker, something that does not struggle because it has already chosen, something that has looked into the abyss and decided to become it. We began this journey on Pike, in the cold halls where a boy learned that cruelty could be power. We watched him grow from a child who tortured his brothers into a man who tortured the world. We followed him into exile, across seas that most sailors feared to sail, into lands where the very air could poison, and the ruins held secrets that should have stayed buried. We saw him gather his tools, the warlocks of Qarth, the artifacts of Ashai, the dragonbinder from Valyria, the holy men for his sacrifices. Each piece carefully collected, each step carefully planned, all in service of an ambition so vast that even now we cannot fully comprehend it. And we watched him return home, transformed from the exiled prince into something far more dangerous. A king crowned not through birthright, but through fear and promises. a man who convinced hardened Ironborn warriors that he could give them dragons and glory, even as he led them toward damnation. Euron Greyjoy is many things: a kinslayer who violated his brother's wife, a pirate who terrorized a dozen seas, a sorcerer who deals in blood magic and forbidden knowledge, a conqueror who broke the Red Wine Fleet and seized the Shield Islands, a madman who believes he can become a god. But above all, he is a warning, a reminder that in the pursuit of power, there are no limits unless we choose to impose them. That knowledge without wisdom is merely a sharper blade to cut ourselves with. That ambition without conscience can reshape the world, but not always in ways we would want to live in. The Ironborn followed him because he promised them everything they had been taught to desire: strength, victory, the right to take what they wanted. And they will follow him to the end because they have already come too far to turn back. Because the alternative, admitting that they were wrong, that their king is leading them to destruction rather than glory, is too painful to accept. This is the tragedy of Euron's story. Not his tragedy, for he feels no regret and seeks no redemption, but the tragedy of those around him, his brothers, who loved and feared and hated him, his crew, who gave up their tongues and their humanity to serve him, his captives, who suffered torments they could never have imagined, and the Ironborn themselves, a people who had survived for thousands of years through strength and cunning, now being led by a man who may well destroy them, whether Euron succeeds or fails, whether his rituals work or backfire, whether he gains his dragons or dies trying. The damage has already been done. The world has been changed by his actions. The Reach has been bloodied. Old Town stands threatened. And somewhere in the east, Victarion sails toward a destiny he does not understand, carrying a horn that may doom them all. George R.R. Martin created Euron as a challenge to his readers, a test of how much darkness we can bear in a story already known for its brutality. And in doing so, he created one of the most compelling villains in modern fantasy, not because we sympathize with him or understand his pain, but because we recognize in him something fundamental about the human capacity for evil. Euron didn't become a monster overnight. He became one through 1,000 small choices. Each time he chose cruelty over kindness. Each time he chose power over humanity. Each time he convinced himself that his goals justified his methods. And eventually, those choices accumulated into something that could no longer be called human. This is the lesson of the Crow's Eye, that monsters are made, not born. That the line between man and monster is crossed not in a single leap, but in a series of steps, each one seeming justified at the time, each one easier than the last. And that by the time you realize how far you have gone, by the time you see what you have become, it is often too late to turn back. The black sails of the silence still haunt the western coast. The Dragonbinder horn still waits to be sounded. The sacrifices continue, and the rituals draw closer to completion. And Euron stands at the center of it all, one eye on the horizon, one eye covered, smiling that terrible smile. What happens next, we do not know. But we know this: the storm is coming. And when it breaks, the world of ice and fire will never be the same. If you found yourself drawn into the darkness of Euron's story, if you see connections and theories that we have not explored, if you have thoughts on what his ultimate fate might be, or what he represents in the larger narrative of A Song of Ice and Fire, share them. Engage with the story. Debate the possibilities. Because that is what great fiction does. It gives us characters and situations complex enough to argue about, dark enough to disturb us, and compelling enough that we cannot look away. Euron Greyjoy is all of those things, a character we love to hate, a villain we cannot ignore, a storm we watch approaching with equal parts fear and fascination. And until George R.R. Martin writes the words that seal his fate, Euron exists in that most powerful state for any character, pure potential. A loaded gun pointed at the world, waiting to see if someone will pull the trigger. Thank you for walking this dark path through the life and crimes of the Crow's Eye, for following the black sails from Pike to the edge of the world and back, for confronting the question of what happens when a man decides that nothing, not even his own humanity, will stand between him and godhood. May you never meet anyone like Euron Greyjoy in your own life, but may you always remember what he represents. The warning written in blood and blue lips and silent screams, that the most dangerous people are not those who lack power, but those who gain it, without ever developing the wisdom or compassion to use it responsibly. The seas remember Euron. The ruins remember him. The warlocks in their chains and the holy men awaiting sacrifice remember him. And the world of Westeros, whether it knows it or not, stands on the edge of an abyss that Euron Greyjoy has spent his entire life preparing to push it into. Subscribe for more journeys into the hidden corners of Westeros and Essos, where the maps end and the monsters begin. And remember, in the Game of Thrones, some players are not trying to win the game. They are trying to burn the board. What is dead may never die, but what is mad may never stop. And Euron Greyjoy is both.